welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. I hope you guys are doing all right. It is, Wednesday? I would explain what took place yesterday. Yesterday was a bit of a mess. But I see my man is in the background, and I want to get to him. He is easily one of my favorite people to talk to. We are joined. John Helmer, Dances with Bears. How you doing, John? You doing okay this morning?
Pretty well, thank you, Jamal, and a happy holiday to you in the coming 24 hours, yeah?
Yeah, 4th of July.
Well, no, sorry, coming up the weekend. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Right.
It's okay. 4th of July. Clear independence. Will Smith beats the aliens. All that good stuff. Right? No, I appreciate it. And thank you for joining me. I always appreciate these conversations.
Thank you for having me.
I have a very specific question. In fact, I think I have maybe 2 or 3 for the interview, and I'm not going to keep you overly long. When this war started in Russia, I remember being at the radio station and asking within the first 3 or 4 months, how does it end? And the reason why I asked that question is because it seems like there were certain problems. One is, even if you wanted to stop, even if you accomplish your objectives of, let's say, taking the Donbass, it doesn't mean that Europe stops. They keep putting money, weapons, etc., into whatever rump state that was left that would continue attacks on Russia. And I couldn't figure out how to get out of that thicket. Has Putin found a way out of that thicket?
Very good question, Jamal. You asked the right question back then, and arguably it was already too late. Let me try to explain and then get to a very interesting exchange that has just played out between Rubio and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Let me explain. Yes, the question becomes what were Russia's war aims when the special military operation began? That is to say, what made it a special military operation, not a declaration of war, a war against Ukraine, a war against the United States, the NATO powers, and the other allies which were arming, financing, and leading Ukraine to attack Russia. What were the war aims then? What have they become now? And what difference would it make? That's an important question, not often asked in the triumphal podcasts, let's call them. Yours, not so triumphal, much more realistic. We'll leave the triumphalism to the professor from the University of Chicago, shall we? So, the war aims were, at the beginning, demilitarization of the Ukraine as a battlefield, denazification of the Ukrainian regime. President Putin has argued and clarified and emphasized that operationally what that would mean is the full security of the accession of the 4 regions plus Crimea. So the Donbass, comprising Lugansk, now fully occupied, Donetsk, not maybe around 90% occupied, but with major cities like Pokrovsk heavily defended, fiercely defended by the Ukrainian side, and Zaporozhye and Kherson regions are significantly less occupied, with continued fighting and with continued advances, slowly, yes, by the Russian side westward through those regions and over those regions into neighboring ones. Suppose, as President Putin said clearly last June, not this past June, the June of 2025, and has repeated many times over, the Russian side would accept as a territorial limit of the 5 regions, Crimea plus the 4, plus a security guarantee so as to achieve what you asked about, an end of war, a security guarantee for Russia in Europe, meaning that the Ukraine battlefield would be secure, that the Russian territories would be secure, the Russian hinterland would be secure, and that in Europe there would be mutual and reciprocal security between the United States and its European allies, including Great Britain. Now, what is the current situation? Pardon me for taking some time here. Demilitarization of the Ukraine has been transformed in meaning from the 2022 Istanbul negotiations for the reason, for the military technology that wasn't even included in the arms limitation papers that came with that agreement, an agreement initialed and then changed and then violated and then superseded. Drone warfare has transformed the battlefield such that it's now possible for the Ukraine to continue fighting Russia without any people in it. In other words, the Ukrainian strategy now is certainly to defend what's left of the 4 territories tenaciously, but then to fall back on succeeding, pardon me, defensive lines all the way to the west, which would leave a firing platform for drone warfare to continue, totally dependent on supplies, money, material, intelligence, targeting, guidance, staffing, and all of that from the United States, from Poland, from Germany, from all the European allies, plus Great Britain, all of whom have committed to fighting a permanent war against Russia. And more than that, they've now committed to remilitarization of Europe with a 5% commitment of GDP to defense spending on that purpose. Now, what does demilitarization as a war aim mean if, under modern conditions of drone warfare, the 4 regions plus Crimea and even the hinterland of Russia and even the external trade of Russia on the high seas in any ocean anywhere, what does it mean for demilitarization if all of that part of the Russian polity and economy and trading system is continuously, permanently under targeting from so-called Ukrainian drone warfare and US and NATO missile guided warfare? Demilitarization becomes very, very difficult to operationalize. First thing. Second, what does denazification mean? At the time, 2022, when you were asking the right question, it seemed clearer. Were the Zelensky regime to be replaced by free elections and a new government, popularly elected, committed to peace with Russia, not war? Were that to happen, were the various forms of racial discrimination against Slavs, against the Russian church to be removed, against the Russian language to be removed, were the doctrines of the neo-Nazi movements of the Ukraine stemming from the original Bandera and other movements that were developed and flourished under German control and German occupation during World War II, were those changes to occur by legislation, by election, by reconstruction of parliament, then Russia would have been satisfied with denazification. What do we have now? What we have now is a situation in which all of NATO is Nazified. That is to say, all of NATO, starting with Germany, Poland, the UK, France, Italy, Finland, I could go on. There isn't any part of the NATO system which isn't fully committed to a doctrine of permanent war against Russia for a combination of old-fashioned racist, supremacist, imperial reasons. Of course, that's the ideology. Under the ideology, technology is an economic base that's being transformed under US direction, under US control. The rearmament, remilitarization of Europe is now to be financed and paid for through the United States. It's almost as if Adolf Hitler were to have been funded by FDR. Can one imagine that? Well, for a time during the 1930s, US banks were financing Adolf Hitler's revival of the German economy. And not only the US banks, but the British ones too. They were all committed at the time to very clear doctrines that building up Germany, and that meant Hitler at the time, would threaten and eventually, let's say, neutralize what was perceived to be the Soviet Union threat, the threat of Joseph Stalin. So what we've got now is we've got a problem of denazification as an original war aim that can't be implemented because all of Europe has been Nazified. Now, let's not go into the question of how that's glossed or forgotten or misunderstood by President Putin's advisors, especially Kirill Dmitriev, the so-called negotiator of the United States. So to go back to your question, here we have a transformation of military technology, which makes it possible for the Ukraine to be threatening the Russian hinterland, Russian trading systems on the high seas, in such a way as was not anticipated or conceived back in 2022. Demilitarization, therefore, means a level of deep demilitarization beyond the territorial limits that Russia's prepared to stop at. How can you achieve that if you do not achieve the total isolation of Ukraine as a firing platform from the rest of NATO?
Right.
Now, the other day, in clarification of one of the issues in hot debate in the pro-Russian podcasts and also in the mainstream media, in clarification of what Russia will do to threaten NATO's retaliation against NATO.
Yes.
Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova said Thursday, I believe it was, and this line hasn't been reported, hasn't been noticed. What she said was, I'm reaching for it, I'll read you the exact line because it clarifies exactly what's meant. In terms of, I'm reading now, in terms of specifically the attacks of the armed forces of the Ukraine on June 22 of this year, I'm reading the wrong paragraph. The position of the Russian Federation in relation to military assistance and the supply of lethal weapons, assistance, and transfer intelligence from the United States to the armed forces of the Ukraine is well known. We've invariably notified the Americans about it, starting with the previous administration. In contacts with Washington's been repeatedly noted that the transfer of military products to the Kiev regime can lead to, now we emphasize, unpredictable consequences for regional and international security. That's the fuzzy phrase, unpredictable consequences. Then she makes something clear. We emphasize that our country regards such convoys as a legitimate military target. Now, the week before, the Defense Ministry of Russia published a list of the addresses, street numbers of the principal Ukraine drone manufacturing plants in Germany, in the UK, and Latvia. The implication was we know the address, we could attack it, and there have been lots of podcasters who want to see an Oreshnik fired at those NATO territories. That's not what the Russian side intends to do. It's not what the Kremlin allows and tolerates. But what did Ms. Zakharova just say? She said convoys are a legitimate target. Now, how do convoys move of arms between Poland, the principal NATO supply hub, and Lvov, and the western regions of the Ukraine. They moved by train and they moved by road. Not one of those train lines has been attacked and destroyed, finally, in all these years of fighting. Why not? Well, that question goes to the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces, President Putin. But now the foreign ministry is saying convoys are a legitimate target, not NATO manufacturing plants, convoys. Fair enough. That would mean that Russia is reserving the right and will, in fact, she threatens, attack any NATO supply line entering by convoy, by delivery, by truck, by railroad, entering the battlefield. That's one issue, and it's completely unresolved. So it's unimplemented. It's a threat without a follow-up. Partly that answers your question.
It does. But basically, isolating Ukraine is the answer.
Yes, isolating Ukraine totally. But let me make a couple of extra points, because they're not being made in the other, let's call them pro-Russian podcasts, the so-called realists or the wishful thinkers that address our audience, and for which you and I have got to compete for attention. Okay? This is the issue. This is the issue. Pardon me for croaking. My voice is a bit croaky. I've had people comment that I should have a teeth job and I should fix my voice. Unfortunately, my voice is a bit croaky today.
Screw those people, John. You're perfectly fine.
No, I'm not going to do anything to my teeth except bite. And the only thing I can do with my voice is soften it a bit and calm down. Mustn't get excited, John. Don't excite me, Jamal. This is not an excitable program. So let's go to the question of how the President Putin thinks, and this goes back to the war aim, a security guarantee for Russia in the future against permanent war can be achieved. Now, President Putin has insisted repeatedly through his spokesman Peskov and Ushakov and himself that there was an agreement with President Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, last August. Yes, and that's called in Russia the Anchorage formula. Now, it's basically, let's trust in Trump to deliver a guarantee of security for Russia in Europe, which implies an end to the permanent war, an end to the, planning, rearmament of all of Europe, including nuclear weapons all the way into Finland, for example, for the future. If that's the Anchorage formula, all sorts of Russian officials, starting with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, but many others, have said that formula is not what the Americans intend. It's not what they're planning. It's not what they're doing. Trump may have said it. Putin may have heard it in Alaska, but you hear very funny things in Alaska. And it's not the only state where you hear funny things. But let's just say the president of Russia misheard, or the president of the United States is a liar. He agreed then, but he's changed his mind. Now, what has then happened in the last few days is Secretary of State Mario Rubio, giving a brief press conference in Bahrain the other day, was asked about this. What happened in Anchorage, Alaska? And he said, I won't reach for the exact quotes. I printed it in Dances with Bear, so if folks want to look at exact documents and get through the croaky voice they're hearing me say all this stuff, go read. It's very quiet. Reading's really quiet job. So what Rubio said was there were proposals. There was no agreement. If there'd been an agreement, the war would have ended. Rather well said. Okay, very clear. No Anchorage formula? Not quite. Because Sergei Lavrov was then asked to respond to what Rubio had said. Now, the Western press and even the Russian press oddly enough, have run what Rubio has said because it gets at the current conflict in Moscow aimed at Dmitriev and at that line influencing Putin and at the possibility that Dmitriev's big US pals, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, remember them? They're the guys who are currently in Doha trying to fool the Iranians for the umpteenth time. There's an argument about whether Witkoff and Kushner should be allowed or invited or welcomed back into Russia. Anyway, let's leave that one aside. What Lavrov has just said, and I'm reaching for it, is something like this. I'll summarize because he said it in quite considerable detail, and a special statement was issued by the foreign ministry yesterday. Basically, it was said, what happened? Here's the context of what happened. Witkoff and Kushner came to the Kremlin in the days before the summit, and we listened to them spell out their proposals. Meaning, Lavrov said proposal, as Rubio said it, was American, not Russian. Okay?
Yes.
Second, we took the proposals to the table with Trump, and President Putin, Lavrov's talk here, looking at Witkoff, went through the proposals one by one. And when he finished reading each one, by the way, President Putin can speak fluent English. I don't know which language he was using at the time. He asked Witkoff, is that correct? And Witkoff said, yes, that's correct. So second point Lavrov is making, the proposals that were tabled between Putin and Trump in Anchorage were American proposals initiated and delivered by Witkoff, repeated by Putin to Trump's face and in front of Witkoff, who confirmed, yes, they were the proposals. What does Lavrov then say? The Russian side agreed to them. Agreed to them. So if we now hear, the rest is my amplification. What Lavrov is saying is, if Rubio now says the proposals were tabled, but no agreement was reached, he was saying the reality is the US side made proposals, the Russian side agreed to them. The agreement came from the Russian side on US application, and now the US is withdrawing from them. Now, if that's exactly what happened, and let's say it's a fairly close combination between what Rubio says and what Lavrov says and what Putin is reported to have said and what Trump heard and did, then here's where we are. It's a very long answer to your question, Jamal. The idea that the US would guarantee the security of Russia in Europe came from Witkoff and the White House. And Putin agreed to make territorial and other battlefield concessions in exchange for it. That was the deal, right? Now, that's pretty significant if you take a look at what the battlefield situation is and what the long-term security is. Russia thought, Putin thought, he sends Dmitriev endlessly to repeat each day and tweeting that the US can be relied on to deliver security in Europe, which means stop rearming Europe against Russia. Since Rubio says there was no agreement, we are now clear there is no agreement. The US has no intention of ending that war. In fact, there's every indication that Trump is counting the personal profits, the family profits. All of the family are getting fat, along with all of his associates, on this rearmament process against Russia. End of Anchorage formula. That's what the US is doing. That's why there can't be an end to this war on a negotiated basis. That incidentally, is a very good reason, wouldn't you say, for never seeing that face, Witkoff's, or that face, Kushner's, in the Kremlin ever again.
Yes. And by the way, Trump is a flagrant liar. So I don't know why anybody would take his word for this. And if you look at the speech, or if you look at what was taking place in Anchorage at the end of it, there seemed to be a proposal. Like it did, both of them were talking as if there was some agreement that was on the table that Putin was going to take back in order to evaluate. So it sounds like the Russian position on this is more honest than the US position on this. And I guess that would explain. I wish they would have just called and asked, and I would have told them, you cannot trust. Like, meaning the Russians, after going through Minsk, and then once again, still believing that the US was going to be some kind of honest actor in this. It's amazing. Okay, so that explains why there's this change in rhetoric coming out of Ushakov, coming out of Peskov, and even when Putin was giving a speech yesterday, making this point about ending the war and even talking about potentially Odessa. I guess, and let me ask it flat, has the Russian position changed? As opposed to me just assuming, has it changed in the context of pursuing and ending the war? And I guess that brings, let's ask that first. Has the Russian position changed?
I think the short answer is no. Pardon me for keeping on coughing and recovering my voice. Basically, we need to see, our audience needs to see Russian decision-making as not a one-man show. There are factions arguing short-term, factions arguing medium-term, factions arguing long-term. And bear in mind, we're in an election campaign. President Putin launched the election campaign for his party, the United Russia Party, the ruling majority in parliament, State Duma, during the week. And he said, we see, I'm quoting, we see and realize our problems. I'm looking down to quote them. We also respond to them. We will absolutely ensure the security of our country and our citizens and the inviolability of Russia's borders for decades ahead. This is our ultimate goal. Right? That's pretty clear, isn't it? And isn't that what all voters want? How then, what's the method? It's reasonable. It was entirely reasonable for the president to say, we are not ready back in 2022, or even now. And I happen to know, because my sources have been telling me for months, it's the General Staff's view, the GRU, the Military Intelligence Agency assessment, that Russia is not ready to fight NATO, not on any of the other fronts. It's preparing, but it needs time. At worst, and we are in the worst scenario, Russia needs time to prepare for a future war. In the meantime, it hopes to deter each of the individual European states, and it hopes, that's pretty wishful thinking if you're thinking Germany now, or the British, but it hopes that insignificant political change will occur inside each of those countries to transform their willingness to accept the terrible domestic sacrifices they're having to pay in order to remilitarize against Russia. So that's a Russian hope. It's a wishful thinking for many of us. And so we come to some bottom line here. Does the Russian decision-making center understand the nature of American imperialism? Does the understanding extend to what the US empire wants to mobilize Europe for? Why is there permanent war by the empire against Russia in Europe, like there is against Iran in the Middle East? Why? We are not here to discuss the dynamics of imperialism. We are here to recognize that that empire isn't falling down. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, not anywhere. But let's be cool about that, okay? What President Putin is saying as an election speech is an absolutely fundamental necessity. I promise you, we will deliver inviolability of our borders for decades ahead. Now, how do you do that, given the particular transformation of the Ukraine battlefield that we've seen? How do we do it when Russian gasoline prices are now equal to US gasoline prices? Diesel's a wee bit cheaper in Moscow today than it is in the United States. But in the last 24 hours, Trump is celebrating that he's gotten the price of gas in the United States ahead of July 4 weekend below $4. And that's exactly where, roughly speaking, A95 benzene costs in Russia today, except that in Russia today, we have spot shortages, regional shortages, and region by region rationing. Okay, and that's the result, not simply of Ukrainian drones, that's the result of US empire strategy. That's what it is.
Extending Russia, or overextending Russia in this case.
It overextending, hitting the people, voters in the pocket, and trying to stimulate as much chaos, opposition, grievance, and trouble as possible. Color revolution stuff, right?
Yes. I guess the question becomes, how does Putin deal with this then? I mean, he's in a box for all intents and purposes. You pointed out that you said it might have already been too late. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've only got a few minutes here, so we won't bore everybody. What do you mean?
I think that's an interesting question, because look, it was a hard choice, right? Either you allow yourself to be surrounded by NATO countries, with Ukraine being overthrown, or you get involved. I don't know another option. And so if it was already too late from the beginning, then what was the way out of that box? It seems like it was always
at the time. It's clear it was a special military operation with a limited number of forces, spearheaded by a special operation, which was an attempt at triggering a coup in Kiev. The special forces flew in. It's known as the Battle of Kostomel, or the Antonov airfield. Russian special forces flew in thinking they could establish a platform for putting deep pressure on Kiev's command and control. From there, the reinforcements, tank lines and what have you, were ready, but the Ukrainians, Americans, and British anticipated what the Russians were going to do. The special forces were met with ferocious defense, and the Russian side was wiped out. So was a reinforcing aircraft. The object of the special military operation with which the SVO began was to overthrow the Kiev government and reach a more amenable Kiev regime, to reach a peace treaty on the basis that the Ukraine would not become a firing platform for the future, and that territorial accommodations would be reached. And it would bring to an end the so-called civil war in the Ukraine, which began with the putsch of 2014. Russia was thinking, let's just make it nice and easy, for pulling a putsch in Kiev in 2022 along the same lines, but with entirely different purpose, from the American putsch in February 2014. That one succeeded, taking President Putin by surprise. The February 2022 putsch, 8 years later, was a Putin initiative. The Ukrainians and Americans anticipated and defeated it. And from then on, we've developed a different set of parameters for fighting this war. Now, where are we in terms of, for example, something that the other podcasters think would be natural? decapitation strikes. Russia has the indefensible Oreshnik and various other hypersonic missiles with very precise targeting. Why not decapitate the regime? We know that President Putin has refused to do that. We know that he had spoken to the man now running as Netanyahu's successor in Israel, Naftali Bennett. Putin told him, you can tell Zelensky can sleep safely at night. I won't try to kill him. We know that that's been a policy, a promise from President Putin. And yet, what do we see the Ukrainians do? This week, the Ukrainian Secret Service attempted to assassinate Vadim Yermolayev in Monaco, of all places. Monaco has never had a political assassination like the attempt at hitting Yermolayev and his wife. She has lost her legs, but so far the top of her is surviving. I don't know what condition Yermolayev is in. There is no doubt whatever that that was a Ukrainian SBU operation. It failed only to the extent that both of the targets, and particularly Vadim Yermolayev, are not yet dead. On the other hand, we know why they did it. We know that Zelensky aimed at removing Yermolayev because he's financing Zaluzhny and other Ukrainian opposition figures that threaten Zelensky, etc. The Ukrainian politics, I leave for somebody more expert than me on it. What do I mention this for? Because the Ukrainians just did a decapitation operation on a territory, let's call it partly France, because that's where the attack was delivered from, and Monaco, which has never happened before, when Russia didn't pull an assassination attempt against Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal in Wiltshire County in March 2018. The British propaganda system persuaded the entire British population that Russia was attacking on British territory and turned the entire event, as they had previously turned the polonium attack, alleged attack, several years earlier, into the ideological foundation for fighting Russia forever because Russia threatens NATO territory. Well, there's an example of Ukraine operating on NATO territory. Well, Monaco isn't quite NATO territory, but you know what I mean. And so does France, and so do all the French. There it was doing that. Okay, and what's also clear, a Ukrainian drone, I don't know if we've mentioned this before, so-called washed up on the shore of Lefkada, a Greek island, proving that the Ukrainians operate within NATO, a NATO state, and with a NATO state permission. They're integrating their drone warfare within NATO, and oops, one of their sea drones lost direction and lost control and washed up, was found by fishermen, and became a significant incident between Greece, the Ukraine, and NATO command. Now that's being pushed under the table by the EU Foreign Minister, Ms. Kallas, who's basically said, it's been a regrettable incident, but it's justified because the Ukraine, she implied, has the right of self-defense against Russia everywhere in the world, starting with the Ionian Sea, Lefkada Island, and what have you. So what we're seeing here is for a start, decapitation urged on President Putin against Kiev regime on the battlefield, being exercised by the Ukrainians in France and Monaco with impunity. Yes, impunity. So what then can a decapitation strike practically or politically achieve in Kiev if all of the NATO states and allies are totally committed to their war against Russia? So we come back to your question. What now can President Putin choose to do that would bring about a satisfactory protection for his people, as he just promised the voters this week? How do you do it? I don't know. What I can tell you.
I'll wait for the answer. I'll wait for the answer. Because that is the operative question. I mean, like, I think Putin is chasing safety. I think even the special military operation was about chasing safety for Russia. I guess the question becomes, even as he's dominating on the battlefield, it just looks like it's getting more remote.
It becomes more difficult. Therefore, we have political argument. Therefore, we have an argument between military staffs, chiefs, generals, and experts. We have political faction fighting around Putin over what's to be done. Okay? Now, the particular characteristic of Putin as a politician is he tries to balance. And good politicians accomplish political balance between competing constituencies in a way that preserves harmony, consensus, and trust in the system to deliver enough that meets everybody's objectives. But if you are facing an empire, if your problem's imperialist in character against you, you can't balance between contradictions as grave, strategic, and fundamental as that. And a problem I've spent much of my time in the last 30 years documenting. President Putin tries to balance contradictions. He has forgotten his Soviet Marxist education, his dialectical method. You can't balance contradictions. They will resolve themselves one way or another, with a whole theory as well as practice, history, economics, military science, and what have you, of how contradictions get solved on battlefields, in markets, and what have you. Okay? So if you try to balance between contradictions between real US objectives and Russian security, you can't. Solution, my initial solution, fire Kirill Dmitriev, because he's trying to tell you you can balance that contradiction in a way which will benefit the Russian oligarchs and himself. Well, you can't fire part of your economic base. You can't. That's why Dmitriev exists. But can President Putin deliver the contradiction he's just promised the Russian voters? Inviolability of Russian borders for decades ahead. Well, the Russian voters say, excuse me, 419 Ukrainian drones came over on Monday. They dropped to about 200 on Tuesday. For last week in Russia, more than 5,100 Ukrainian projectiles, drones, and missiles came over, and they hurt or killed up to 285 Russian civilians. Excuse me, that's not an inviolability of Russia's borders, is it? And that was last week, that was Monday, that was Tuesday.
Europe is trying to overwhelm. That's it, and we can close it. I mean, there's obviously a lot more that we can discuss, but it seems that Europe is trying to overwhelm. Well, I guess the two things. One, Kaja Kallas would never say that about Iran taking the Strait of Hormuz, meaning they would not take the position that, well, Iran is defending itself against the United States, so they can defend themselves anywhere they need to defend themselves. She would never say that. The second point, they seem to be trying to overwhelm the Russian defenses. Basically, if we can get enough drones in, then more drones will be able to get through. And because the Russians aren't ready to fight NATO yet, then we can continuously escalate against Russia without them ever retaliating directly back with us. They believe they're in a catbird seat in this position. Well, John, you are fantastic. Great breakdown, man.
No, wait a minute. It's not me. That's a mistake. It's a compliment. I'll accept the compliment, Jamal. I'm just laying out the way it is. And I try to check, am I wrong, by talking to sources and by reading as carefully as I can and listening to his varied opinions. What I'm not, I'm sorry it disappoints some audiences on some podcasts, I'm not hopeful. I'm not hopeful at all. I'm not miserable. I'm not hopeful. Politics and military affairs, when you're at war, require solutions. You owe it to your people. You owe it to your family. You owe it to your own blood. You will. You'll find solutions, right? But solutions aren't to be found in triumphal announcements for the last 4 years that Russia's going to win this war and annihilate the other side, because nor will we achieve Russia's objectives by minimizing the intelligence, the calculation, and the power of the United States. Doesn't work. We aren't going to find solutions by minimizing the intelligence of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. No way.
And we can close it on this. If you're not hopeful, what is your expectation? Meaning saying I'm either hopeful or not hopeful. I'm either triumphalist or I am not. Has this a view of outcome on some level? Because otherwise they would, it's just unclear. But I think you have a view of things in regards to what you think is going to effectively come about. What do you think, let's say within the next 2 years, 3 years? What do you expect?
Well, some people have been suggesting that I'm so old, I mightn't have 2 years. I'm glad they bracketed me with Michael Hudson. Somebody said yesterday as a comment, I found it very amusing and I accept the compliment, that Michael Hudson and I are two old men whose grip of the analytical issues remains remarkable for our age. Okay, I think that's pretty funny.
So, it's like they're pretty on it for their age. Yeah.
maybe the old boy doesn't have 2 years. Okay, fine. Let's just say that, like any politician, I'm operating on a short-term clock. So the short-term clock for Russia now is 18 to 20 of September, when Russian parliament will be elected. And the short-term issue is, how will the opposition to President Putin do in response to his promise to make the borders inviolable? Will he come up with a portfolio of actions, not talk? Russians aren't dopes. I mean, we know the difference between talking and doing, and we just heard Maria Zakharova say, NATO convoys are legitimate targets, especially if they've crossed the border from Poland. So let's hit them. That's a very, very strong view, especially in among Russian male voters over the age of, let's say, 30. Okay? Mm-hmm. Let's see if that will be done in the next week or two, right? 1. 2, what if, because of the self-inflicted wounds on the Russian economy, we have disinvestment, promises of disinvestment for all the major oligarch groups, the steel groups, the coal mining groups, the aluminium, disinvestment because the Russian central bank, protected by President Putin, is committed to anti-inflation high interest rate and attempts to cut the budget, the federal budget, to limit the ability of Russia to increase its military capacity to achieve its war aims on the battlefield. The problem there is get rid of Elvira Nabiullina. Okay, so on the short term, were President Putin to find the nice exit for Dmitriev, let him produce tweets for the rest of his life, employ him very richly at RT, and he can produce tweets 2 or 3 a day, just like he's doing, different employer, harmless. Now let's also find retirement benefits for Elvira Nabiullina. Maybe she and her husband would like to move to Monaco, except it's unsafe at the moment. True. If those two were removed as symbols of President Putin deciding, I can balance and I can deliver, then this would be a big achievement. I would get really more hopeful between now and September. Okay, so they're just two tests of waving goodbye to a problem that would enable me to say, President Putin has found a way of balancing, and we are therefore in a greater position to expect that the new parliament will have a consensus about demilitarizing what's left of the battlefield and preparing for the long war. We will not be visited by Witkoff and Kushner again, and we will do what you have to do when you face an empire. Act unpredictably, do things they don't anticipate. They have, you see them, there are some ex-CIA men who now represent themselves as pro-Russians on podcasts. They seem to know everything about Russia. Well, if an ex-CIA man who only had 4 years in the agency knows so much about Russia, just imagine how veterans of the CIA who spent 25 years studying Russia, how much they must know. Well, the way to solve them as a threat is to prove that they don't know what's coming. And they can't, through John Radcliffe, deliver to President Trump in the upstairs family quarters the conviction that he knows what Putin's limitations are. It's very clear from the way Trump makes remarks. He thinks he knows what Putin's limitations are. I'm sure the president of Russia thinks he guards his limitations very carefully. After 30 years of watching him, I don't think he guards them all that well. He acts consistently. Therefore, now's the time to act unpredictably. So, short answer, Jamal, I don't have maybe 2 years left. I wish long life to Michael Hudson too. But act unpredictably between now and September. We might have a parliamentary consensus to do things the empire isn't expecting. And if we do things like that, the entire ideological structure of rearmament, the Nazification of NATO, will begin to feel far more insecure for those who profit from it.
Deterrence. What you're talking about is deterrence. So, John,
yes,
I definitely appreciate you, my man. Thank you for this. Great breakdown, as always. And the audience love you so much, just says, I love this man. So, in the audience, you have my appreciation. John Helmer, Dances with Bears. Thank you for this. You be safe, okay?
Thank you, Jamal. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Absolutely. Bye. All right. Shout out to John. I loved that conversation. John knows his stuff. And I would like to point out that when you have guests and the guests dovetail, they're hitting it from a different angle, but what they're talking about is a similar problem. And that similar problem is, how do you end the war? How do you end the war, right? I mean, this has been going on for nearly 5 years, and the population itself obviously is sick of it. No one in their right mind will want drones randomly flying, dropping kerosene, or hitting buses, or hitting schools, or whatever, or terrorists blowing up rock concerts. And you, as a population, know that the United States was directly involved in it. Europe was directly involved in it. But the president was, in his efforts to come to a soft landing of sorts, was willing to talk with these monsters, was willing to act like this one particular monster is somehow different than the other monsters that particular one monster is effectively leading, just because that monster was claiming that he was going to end the war. And by the way, as I covered the Anchorage summit, and when I was doing the video, I was pointing out, it sounds like the way that they are talking was that there was a deal, there was some proposal, there were some agreements that these guys were coming in organizing around. Truth be told, there is no agreement until everything is agreed upon. So that axiom remains true. But this is a little bit different. The Russian side was making the argument, well, wait a minute, you gave us proposals, and now you're acting like those proposals didn't necessarily exist. Now, you can make an argument that was just another Minsk type subterfuge, which at that point, It's like, dude, this happened once. He shouldn't have been able to be fooled again, but whatever. Another mince type subterfuge of, hey, no, really, if you just keep it chill on the battlefield, we will eventually come to some kind of agreement and soft landing. And oh, it's the Europeans that are pushing back against this, et cetera, et cetera. My argument that I made, and I want to move over to Iran before Dan comes on. The argument that I made, I think this was last year, months ago, was that ultimately Russia understood that the US wasn't necessarily to be trusted, but couldn't do anything about it in the moment, if that makes sense. If you start off with like 150,000 men and you are fighting a force 3 times your size, you're able to win the battles, but you're not necessarily able to hold the territory because you don't necessarily have enough manpower in order to pull that off. The issue, obviously, in this case, is manpower. You grow your military. You may understand that at some point, Europe is not going to negotiate. The US is not going to negotiate. They're attacking me and going after my gas and going after my energy. They're trying to create a strategic defeat economically and militarily on Russia. That's what they want to accomplish. They're not deviating from this goal. You build your military. You build your military because you need to deal with the Ukraine issue, but you're also building your military with the idea that at some point, if they don't stop, we will be fighting all of Europe with the potential of also the US. Like, meaning, if you're Putin in this scenario and you're looking at this and you're weighing this stuff, maybe you're not going to be the most provocative in the beginning of a war if you can't necessarily see yourself or extrapolate whether or not you can effectively defend Russia against all of the allied powers, including the US. So you build, you institute the legal structures in order to call up men. You institute the industrial structures in order to build up a military and have a war footing and have a war economy of sorts. Kind of, not entirely, but you get my point. Meaning, you build your industrial base, you build your legal structures, you prepare, you build up an arsenal that you think will be necessary in order to have that fight, whether those are the sci-fi weapons, whether that's the thing you fly up in space in order to blow up, in order to destroy electromagnetic pulse for the satellites, whether it's the tsunami creating device, meaning you do this stuff when you are preparing for a larger struggle. And maybe you don't necessarily want that struggle to kick off before you are militarily prepared to be able to fight that struggle. A lot of people have made this argument that Putin is effectively weak, he is not provocative enough, and all of those things. And I think I've even made those arguments because from my point of view, passivity in the face of a hawkish entity doesn't get you anywhere. It's not pragmatic. It allows them to go further and further, believing that your red lines are fictitious. I guess my point is, you will indeed fight in a box. In the case of saying, we are going to prosecute the war in Donbass. That's what we're going to do. We're not trying to fight all of Europe. We're going to prosecute the war in Donbass. Now, obviously, this allows Europe to say, well, he is isolating himself to Ukraine, so we can get closer and closer and closer to the line without him responding to it, because he doesn't necessarily want to fight all of us. Whereas from Putin's point of view, I need to build up my military, the military structures, to have those things in place for a larger fight to come. Meaning, it's not incomprehensible in the way that Putin is looking at this. All wars are a risk, especially if you're going to have the ultimate risk, the ultimate ante of a thematic war against nuclear powers. No right, sane person will want to get involved in that. By the same token, you may, knowing that, is ironically the thing that allows countries to push their luck, using that as the thing to negotiate around. Basically, I know you don't want to end the world. I really don't want to end the world either, but I know you don't want to end the world. So I'm going to get close to the line and dare you to do something that may risk ending the world. It's that fight. It's terrifying because at some point, somebody is going to cross that line. And I suspect that from the Russian point of view, they want to be prepared for it when NATO does. It's terrifying. When John said he's not hopeful, why would he be? If you really think about it, the reason why I was asking the question, and I'll move to Iran real quick after this. The reason why I was asking the question early on, back, I don't know, like a year when this first started, because I couldn't see the way out. From my point of view, at any point along the contact line where the Russians stop, the Ukrainians fortify, NATO dumps in weapons, money, materials, etc. Because from their point of view, we're just giving money, and every dollar that we give is a Russian that gets murdered. This is what we're effectively doing in regards to this kind of platform that Ukraine would ultimately become. Wherever you stop, the other side of Ukraine fills up with weapons. NATO fills it with money, weapons, everything else, and you use that to launch terrorist attacks into Russia itself. And from the NATO standpoint, Russia's not hitting us. We're not getting hit with bombs. We're not getting hit with missiles. We are able to effectively use this proxy to accomplish our objectives without risking our life and limb. Obviously, that calculus needs to be changed. But at the time frame, again, a small military going into Ukraine, wherever it stops, the rest of Ukraine is used as a platform. Even if you end up with a rump state that is not even politically viable per se, it doesn't need to be politically viable to be a terrorist haven to launch attacks into Russia. That's a thicket. That's a problem that needs to be solved. And, you know, in having the conversation with John, how do you solve that problem? That's a good question. I don't have an answer to the question, which is why I was asking minds better than my own, or at the very least minds who have covered this for a very, very long time. And ultimately, their assessment was just this grim. It's John's. Somehow you either need to isolate Ukraine from the rest of Europe. And that, at the very least, will prevent the weapons and everything else from coming in that will be allowed to use to hit your people. Yeah, the Kremlin needs to come to an assessment. I mean, the rub is, like I said, passivity doesn't necessarily get you anywhere. And more provocative action, despite the fact that it may risk war, ironically, may be objectively the most sensible course of action. Yeah, I'm thinking through it because I'm trying to figure out how to say it in a specific way. It's the sword holder dilemma. If I'm the person who's holding the sword to end the world, if you know that I may end the world, you may leave me to my devices. If you believe that I may not, you may attack me, which may end up with me ending the world anyway. It's the confidence of it. The sword holder has to have this capability of being able to end it all. And for it to be understood that they would end it all in order to avoid ending it at all. It's the mutually assured destruction dilemma. Don't test me. Don't test me, I have nukes. But before I get to David, or before David gets in, I would like to hit what is taking place in Iran. I have become more and more in the mindset that this is a peace trap. And what I mean by peace trap is we are going to accomplish through peace what we couldn't necessarily accomplish through war. I think it's a fair point to say that the first skirmish that the United States effectively evolved itself in Iran, incompetence, hubris, bad intel, you can add all sorts of things that were into the milieu or into the mix. But the reality of it is the United States went half-cocked against the country and got humbled. Its bases destroyed, Strait of Hormuz taking its war booty. The U.S. wasn't able to do anything about it. And all of this happening on the grand stage of planet Earth, with everybody being able to see. Obviously, this is humiliating. On top of this being humiliating, Iran at this point makes demands against an empire. We want our wars to stop. We want our money back. We want basically reparations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The US, being behind the eight ball, because Iran's strategy in this particular case made sense, ends up signing a humiliating memorandum of understanding in order to get the Strait of Hormuz open so energy can go through the strait and Donald Trump wouldn't necessarily be dealing with $8 gas prices. Iran accepts this memorandum of understanding. Now, the fact of the matter is Iran has limits as a country, and in any kind of war against a country that spends $1.5 trillion, they are going to have to fight that war in a particular way. You can call it asymmetric warfare, whatever you want to call it, but they're going to have to fight it within a box. And they're going to have to stay within the context of their strategy in order to impart tax and cost on the states. When they were hitting Israel, when they were hitting the surrounding countries, the neighboring countries that the United States effectively allied with and put their military bases with, does the US entirely care that they're hitting those countries? Maybe, I suspect, but obviously they're not going to care as much as Iranians care about the United States murdering its own citizenry. I hope you get my point. The US is not going to care about the Arab states getting hit. It may care about Israel getting hit. And between, let's say, the level of concern, I would wager to you Iran cares more about its citizens than the United States cares about Gulf states. I'm trying to balance these things. The US, who ends up in this memorandum of understanding, as I pointed out, was going to flagrantly and remorselessly violate that memorandum of understanding from day one. And I was right. That's exactly what they did. The reason that I knew that is because entities that hold a certain level of political power, the levers of those power is never given away in earnest. It's never, all right, you win, we're out. Congratulations. It's never that. If anything, it's we are going to reposition and we're going to continue with what we were doing prior. And you're going to have to force us from the reposition, in which case we would once again reposition and continue what we were doing. Take it out of this context. Put it in the context of FDR in the New Deal. You had the Roaring '20s, you had the Great Depression. In the way that Professor Wolf explains it, FDR goes for the rich, says, look, we need to take from you in order to give to the poor. Otherwise, we're going to have a revolution in America. FDR passes the New Deal. But if you've noticed, it's not like the situation where the rich just said, oh, well, you win. Whittled away at over the course of the years to end up in the situation to which we have now in the United States, where under Bill Clinton, they were getting rid of welfare. Donald Trump is about to go after Medicare and Social Security. You have no safety net in real terms. They whittled away. They went after it. They didn't just give up. They repositioned and continued the war, maybe slowly at first, but they continued the war. I'm saying the same thing is true with the US. Yes, the US signed a memorandum of understanding. And yes, you got a huge amount of crying and complaining from Israeli Zionists and American firsters. But the US, just because they are complaining about Israel, doesn't mean that our policy towards Israel has changed. And if you notice, Israel remained in Lebanon, burrowed, they were further in Lebanon. And the same US that signed a deal saying all war stop went to Lebanon's government, a puppet, in order to negotiate a deal, quote unquote, negotiate a deal between Lebanon and Israel to effectively allow Israel to carry out murders in southern Lebanon, as if southern Lebanon wasn't part of Lebanon. A country that is attending to the terms of the deal doesn't do that. They do that because their plans from the standpoint of the US and Israel hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is needing the Strait of Hormuz open so the US can fill its coffers full of oil, energy, products, etc., to get up to the point of doing their next push against Iran. It may be in months, it may be in years, but that push will be coming. I'm trying to point out that US policy hadn't changed. I don't know why people thought it changed. And just because Donald Trump drops an F-bomb to Netanyahu doesn't necessarily mean that these things are separate and distinct from one another. Policy of the US is to pretend as if there's separation between the US and Israel. So Israel becomes a sin eater, despite the fact that we give them billions and we completely protect them, either militarily or for that matter, in the UN Security Council. Policy hasn't changed. Now, the catch becomes, is Iran getting something out of this to compensate for the fact that the US is going to try to find a way to get around the advantage that Iran has been able to find? Meaning, Iran has found something that, for whatever particular reason, the administration didn't think that they could actually take, which is the Strait of Hormuz. This is less a military weapon, more of an economic cudgel, but it's an economic cudgel that is made bank. When you see gas going to $4.50 as a direct result of the US attacking the country and the country responding, that is an amazing thing. That is a tax. That's a sanction for all intents and purposes that is basically being put on each and every person in this country that has to drive, pay gas, or need and require energy for anything. That includes even feeding ourselves or even buying Pampers. I'm saying that's something new. That's something different. So what did the US do? Rational actor. We're going to stop. We're going to try to open the strait, which is their main weapon. And we're going to try to find a way to get around the strait. So we are going to try to find a way of allowing shipping to go through in order to negate the weapon that Iran has been able to get their hands on. Rational actor. Now, you can say it's not a rational act to attack Iran in the first place, but if you're an imperial power, Syria has fallen, you believe that this is your best chance of going after Iran, you don't believe Russia and China are going to get involved militarily, you take a chance. You believe you've isolated them. Now, obviously, from Iran's point of view, part and parcel to the reason that they are protecting Hezbollah is not out of altruism, it's because it's their ally in the region. It's a rational act. And in the context of being a rational act, what you don't want is your ally to be destroyed in the same way that Syria was destroyed, which obviously opened the door to Iran. If Hezbollah is destroyed in the region, which is part and parcel of the reason for the isolation of southern Lebanon, basically, we want to isolate, we want either Jelani's goons, or we want the Israelis to effectively destroy Hezbollah. If we can create a civil war in Lebanon where the Lebanese government does it, all the better. Destroy Lebanon, isolate Iran, go back after Iran. The policy, on some level, writes itself. Trump, in this case, however, needs the energy and oil to flow. And he needs it to flow in order to fill up our coffers, allow the world to get its oil and everything else, in which case he would find another way of going after Iran. And the point I'm just basically trying to make is the US is using the time frame in order to try to find a way to mitigate the impact of the Strait of Hormuz. And if it can find a way to mitigate the impact of the Strait of Hormuz, it can then attack without response. Because again, I'm not entirely sure how much we care about those bases. And according to the Wall Street Journal, we're moving those bases back anyway. We were shocked at the level of damage that Iran could do to those bases. And so we're trying to find ways to reposition. What we want and what we would prefer is finding a solution to the Strait issue, in which case we can resume military strikes against Iran. That's the plan. So is it a peace trap? Yes. Does Iran know it's a peace trap? Lord knows, I hope. And I'm saying I hope because the Russians believe Trump. When Trump was going with this idea of, hey, we're going to make peace. We're going to make peace. I'm pretending as if I'm not party to the war and all of this other stuff, which was effectively Minsk 3. You could say Anchorage was Minsk 3. Iran is in a peace treaty. Now, let's be honest. It's not infinitely powerful. There are limits. And it's a country that has been under sanctions, that has been attempted to isolate, but it's been able to use its geography, its competence, its military and technical capability, its scientific acumen, in order to defend itself in a way that Iraq and many of these other countries were not able to do so. Iran is an extraordinarily important part of any notion of a multipolar world, and is one of the fulcrum countries, China and Russia being the other two, that the empire continuously bumps its head against when it's looking at the world for control. I guess the point I'm trying to make, and I'll end it on this. People with this idea that the United States is seeking retrenchment is out of their minds. That is not what we're seeing around the globe. We're seeing a naked hegemon that has gotten more aggressive, more dangerous in trying to maintain its power and control of the globe and exert that power and control in a way that is far more naked now than it was prior. It's very Hitlerian, even though in this particular case, the Europeans are firmly in the camp of Hitler. We are attacking countries willy-nilly, without pretext. We are murdering people, again, without pretext. We are snatching world leaders and throwing them into prisons without pretext. We're doing this for hashtag reasons. Now, obviously, those reasons involve control, domination, and the exertion of control across the globe. But people making this argument that the United States is accepting multipolarity, I think I've always said that that was nonsense. Empires don't necessarily just let go of the wheel, let go of the handle. Oftentimes, they're going to hold that going all the way down, making repositions as necessary in order to maintain whatever capability they have at any particular level. The US, in this case, is no different. And I would hope that at this point, it is obvious. Iran is in a peace treaty. That's what I think. They may have gone into it willingly. They may have even gone into it knowingly, especially if they needed a breather and they needed time to reposition, rebuild, et cetera, meaning they may be in a peace trap, but it may not necessarily be one that they went in unwittingly. They went in because they needed the time themselves. So stay tuned. This is not over. I will be reporting on this as it happens over the course and how it evolves and escalates. So, yeah, we're in a chaotic world. We're in a very chaotic world. All right, I'm going to end this. I am going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I'm going to be on the program at 9. Shout out to John Helmer. I'll see if David can come later. He said he was running late in traffic. I don't know what that exactly means in regards to time frame, so I'm going to call it a day. Later on at 10 o'clock, Lake Maruth is going to be on the show. Lake Maruth. So we're still going to get out 2 for the day. And I'll see what David is doing a bit later. If he is free, maybe we can still bring him on today. Oh, before I let you go, if you guys enjoy the content, like, share, subscribe. You can support the content, PayPal, Patreon, Super Chats. If you enjoy fantastic interviews like John Helmer just gave, where he gave a fantastic breakdown. John always gives a great breakdown. And so definitely you can consider membership to the channel, or for that matter, you can just support the content. Help, even liking the video and sharing the videos, help this work and help push this work. The goal of this channel is at the very least 100K. We are slowly making our way there. This channel has had headwinds. I think it's obvious at this point, since the 3 months away for illness and coming back. But we are pushing forward nonetheless. All right, there's that. The second point has to do with the trip to Iran. I don't know if this trip is going to take place. And in fact, I am almost certain it's not going to take place. Yesterday, all of this is happening at the last minute. And one of the things that was required in order to get into any country, but specifically Iran, is you need a visa. Now, the electronic system associated with the thing just doesn't work. At least for Americans, it doesn't seem to work. And so that wasn't even something that could be done on my side. It had to be something done on their side in order to get the visa, which means, how do you pay for your visa if indeed you weren't the one that put the information in order to pay for your visa? And how do you pick it up? All right, there is no embassy between the United States and Iran. And so what's used is a Pakistan embassy. I know this is a lot of information, but I'm going somewhere with it. There's a Pakistan embassy. Pakistan embassy has, it's like a network or something where it would do embassy business for Iran. It only does this business at very specific time frames that are limited over the course of the week. Tuesdays and Thursdays. All right. So on Tuesday, at the last minute, I need to find a way to get to DC. I wanted to book a train, but my uncle was open to taking me to DC. I don't like this idea because I would prefer to go by myself, if I'm being honest. And I don't like to belabor other people with work if I don't have to. But in a practical sense, and in a family sense, I agree. All of us go to DC. We get there at 2:10. I get in by about 2:15, and I am told, oh, by the way, they close at 2:00. Now, the sources online claim that they stay open until 6. I think I saw somewhere 3, but apparently they close at 2. So a trip that is supposed to take place within a day, I need a visa now to even get on an airplane, as far as I know. And I am effectively told, sorry, we're closed. When is the next time they open? Thursday. When is the flight supposed to leave? Well, I don't know yet, but ideally, Thursday. Like, it was a clusterfuck. It was a clusterfuck. So, more likely than not, that trip is not happening, to my chagrin, because I definitely wanted to go, and I definitely wanted to, honestly, even just seeing Professor Miranda would have been nice. But that is what has been taking place. That is why I wasn't here yesterday, because between clinic schedule and heading to DC, making basically a 6-hour trip, spending over $100 for that trip, just because it's family. You still got to pay family more than you paid the train. You still have to do that. So it's basically a waste. All things being equal, if I had to waste somebody's time, I would have only preferred to waste my own. And having family members take that trip, basically a 6-hour round trip, is the worst aspect of it. So, long story short, I will most likely not be going anywhere. I will most likely be here. I don't know plans in the future on this stuff because nobody has had answers. So most likely, long story short, you'll probably see me here Thursday, Friday, etc. I don't think the trip is going to happen. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up on what's taking place and why. All right, you all be safe. You all be kind. And I will see you bright and early tomorrow morning. Oh, by the way, Late Maruth will be on at 10 a.m. He'll be on at 10 a.m. So it'll be really good to get Late's take on the stuff, which is why I kept John to the Russian topic. Because Late's going to be the one to cover the Middle East. Like, share, subscribe, support, PayPal, Patreon, Super Chats, memberships. All of those things are helpful. All of those things pay for the content. And you all be safe. I'll see you guys at 9 o'clock on the program, 10 o'clock on with Late. Have a good one all.